I wonder if you could name one poet who's been a major influence on you and just talk about what you learned from that poet and how he or she shaped your work.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably talk about a lot of those, but I guess to choose one, I think Emily Dickinson maybe has been most, her or Wallace Stevens have probably been most influential on me. I would say, I'll talk about Dickinson just because it gets to something that I think is important about poetry, which is that, you know, she was very much outside of tradition because of a lot of things, because of her gender, for one, but also I just think because of her approach to what poetry is, but she was also deeply inside a tradition in that, you know, most of her poems are based on these sort of ballad, you know, common meter form, and I think that's what you need to be as a poet. Like, even if the tradition is resisting you, you have to find a way to, I mean, there's really, it's a, you know, poetry is thousands of years old. There's really not any point in calling yourself a poet if you don't think yourself part of that tradition. You know, you could just, you know, design video games or cell phones or whatever, which is fine. I mean, that, you know, but I'm just saying, like, you don't have to be a poet, but if you are going to be a poet, it involves both involvement with the tradition and resistance to it. And I think that's how Dickinson is really important to me, because she's resisted by tradition, and yet she's a part of it, and she resisted tradition, and yet she has become a part of it. And I think that, you know, if you have to use the best American poets thus far as models, like, to be successful poets, it's like Whitman or Dickinson, right? So you either publish your own work and write very flattering reviews of it in periodicals, that would be anonymously, that would be Whitman, or you just shove all your poems in a drawer and die, you know, and that's Dickinson. And I think, I don't know, I always think that that's something to think about for younger poets, because there's an industry around poetry that's, you know, MFA programs and magazines and this sort of thing, and that hardly, I don't know, that all seems to get so much, that gets very far away from what I think of as tradition, you know, and being involved with the work itself, you know, that sort of industry around the work. And, you know, she's probably the great American poet, and she has no relation to any poetry industry. And I just use that as kind of a touchstone, or like something to keep in mind as I keep writing, because yeah, I just think it's important, you know, to think that way and to be involved with the art. And the industry, you know, might be necessary to your life, or it might not be, you know. Certainly not necessary to the poetry. So that's one. I mean, I could name 4,500 more, maybe, but that's one example. Good question. Yeah, here.
I've got a question. Why Meister? What attracted you to it, and the challenges of kind of working with the German? If you saw some voice there that you felt you could speak to, or
yeah, it's a kind of a weird and sort of long story that I'll tell a short version of. So when one of my first books came out, someone wrote me a letter and said, "I read your book. I really like it. It's sort of strange to see an American poet influenced by Ernst Meister." And I was like, I have no idea who Ernst Meister is. Whatever influence it was very deep and secretive. And then the next week, I think, I was at Woodland Pattern, which is this amazing bookstore in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's an all-poetry bookstore, and they have every poetry book ever. And I was giving a reading there, and I was browsing the shelves before the reading, and there was this Ernst Meister book. Richard Dove, who's a fairly well-known translator, he's British, translates from the German, had done a selected poems of Meister. And I pulled it down, and I looked at it, and I kind of got it. I was like, yeah, I see why this person thinks this. But the translation seemed very sort of wooden and kind of not, I don't know, they seemed like more sketches for poems or outlines of poems. And then, so I would just start, you know, when I couldn't write or was just too busy to do my own writing or was not interested in doing my own writing, which happens with great frequency, I would, you know, sort of slowly try to translate these poems. They're short, as you can tell, so, you know, you can kind of, I mean, you can sit with it for a while and let it kind of percolate. And then, so that was just like a hobby, or, you know, something I would do to just stay involved with writing. And then I ended up meeting my dad's wife's daughter's husband, who is Sam Frederick, who I do these translations with, at my dad's retirement party, and he's a German professor. And I said, oh, you know, of course, like the opportunistic guy, you should look at my poem. You know, it's like, I never do that with my own poems, but I was like, wow, it's these translations, it's not really being, I'm not really foisting this on him, this is his area of study. So, and he was like, I've never heard of that guy. And so I was like, wow, so this German professor, I kind of thought, well, Meister is probably like a famous German poet or something. And he's like, I've never heard of him, but you should show me the translations. And I sent him translations, and he was like, oh, wow, these poems are fantastic. Your translations, not so great. Or like okay in places, but not fabulous. And so he was like, why don't we just let's work on this. Let's do this together. So it kind of became an experiment in friendship and family. And so we've been doing this for several years now. And it's great. Like, we come up with skeletal translations for each other and send them to each other over emails. And so we did Meister's last 3 books, which is kind of a loose, informal trilogy of books. Yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
So he's a pretty good poet as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a really interesting poet. And it was sort of...
I bet your collaborator.
Oh, no, he's not a poet, he's a German scholar. Yeah, I mean, he writes on Thomas Bernhard and Stifter and Robert Walser and people like that. He kind of does Austrian, everyone's like, who are these people? But yeah, I mean, he writes sort of narrative theory about Austrian prose writers of the early 20th century and late 20th century periods. But he's fluent in German and knows the tradition and is very, you know, good with etymologies. And we're both kind of, you know, dabblers in philosophy too, and Meister was a philosophy student at the University of Marburg. I mean, he's a very weird, I mean, I won't go on about this yet. I mean, after this you can ask me about him if you have an interest in this, but there's a whole, Meister was a poet with these deep sort of theological and philosophical interests, and he was doing a dissertation on Nietzsche when Hitler, you know, Karl Loth was his advisor, who was Jewish, who had to leave the country because of the Nazis. So he never finished his dissertation on Nietzsche, etc. So there's a lot going on, and if you're into that stuff, this poetry is very fascinating because it's all tied into those thinkers, which I don't have strict academic background in, but I can sort of recognize the tropes and the concerns of Nietzsche, Heidegger, people like that. Gadamer was one of his teachers at Marburg, you know. So